Hi, I'm Ray Kurzweil. It's a pleasure to be with you, at least virtually. This is fairly crude virtual reality. That's another thing that's going to advance in terms of brain-computer interfaces as we go forward. And I appreciate this opportunity to share thoughts, at least in one direction. I would have liked to have participated in person. Unfortunately, a conflict came up. We're introducing a product at the Consumer Electronics Show. Again, in a 1-second pitch for that, it's Bleo. It's an e-reader. Books are going virtual. Everything is going virtual. Ultimately, our brains will be enhanced in the same way. And as you can see, I'm wearing my XPrize pin here. I've enjoyed my participation on the board. And I understand one of the things that we'll be talking about at this conference is a potential prize to facilitate human brain machine enhancement, connection, merger, if you will. That is actually the direction I see ultimately for artificial intelligence. Let me provide a little bit of background for a few minutes on where I see artificial intelligence going and how that ultimately will merge with our biological intelligence. And we're really doing that already. I mean, the fact that half the farmers in China can take these devices out of their pocket and access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes is making us smarter. It certainly makes me smarter. I'm routinely at dinner just taking this out and resolving a factual point by accessing the entire human knowledge base very fluidly. And that really changes who we are, changes our social networks. And these devices are not yet inside our bodies and brains, but we're going to move in that direction. They're certainly a lot closer than they used to be. When I was a student here at MIT, I had to take my bicycle across campus to get to the one computer that MIT had that was shared by thousands of students. And this is 1,000,000 times cheaper and 1,000 times more powerful. That's a billion-fold increase in price performance that we've seen. So let me say a few things, spend a couple of minutes on what I call the law of accelerating returns. Many of you have heard me talk about this, but it's really a key issue in understanding the future and understand why the future is going to be so different, because it's going to be animated by these information technologies. And information technology progresses exponentially, not linearly, and there's a profound difference. Here we have the history of computation in the 20th century, now going into the 21st century. I have a version of this in The Singularity is Near, and that only goes to 2002. We just updated this to 2008. And I was actually asked, aren't you nervous? It may have veered off course, but it's really remarkable as to how predictable these trajectories of information technology are if you measure the underlying properties of these technologies, like the price performance of computing. But it's not just computing. It's not just Moore's law. In fact, even computation is not just Moore's law. This exponential growth of computation started decades before Gordon Moore was even born. And when one paradigm runs out of steam, it creates research pressure to create the next paradigm. This goes through 5 different paradigms: electromechanical calculators, relay-based computers, vacuum tube computers in the 1950s. CBS predicted the election of Eisenhower for the first time using a vacuum tube computer in 1952. They were then shrinking vacuum tubes, making them smaller and smaller. That was the way in which computers progressed exponentially in the 50s. That hit a wall. They couldn't shrink the vacuum tubes and keep the vacuum, and that led then to the 4th paradigm, transistors, and finally to Moore's law, the shrinking of components on an integrated circuit. That's going to come to an end. Gordon Moore originally said 2002. Intel now says 2022. But if you speak to Justin Ratner, the chief technology officer of Intel, he'll tell you that they have already invented the 6th paradigm. It's in an early stage, but they still have another decade to go before we need to go into the 6th paradigm, which is 3-dimensional computing. There's already harbingers of that. Your cell phone has 3-dimensional chips, primitive multi-layer circuits, but we're actually going to go to 3-dimensional self-organizing molecular circuits. Intel has these working in their lab, so do other places. We'll have that probably in the teen years. That's what Justin Ratner thinks. That'll go to the sixth paradigm and keep this going for a long time. This is a logarithmic graph. Every level on this graph is 10,000 times greater than the level below it. So this kind of shrinks the progress. This little curve here represents trillions-fold increase in the amount of computation, the amount of memory, the amount of calculations that you can get per dollar since the 1890 American census. A billion-fold increase just since I was an undergraduate. And a straight line is exponential growth on a logarithmic scale. This is actually another exponential. Took 3 years to double the price performance of computing in 1900, 2 years in 1950, 12 months in the year 1900, year 2000. It's now down to 11 months. So there's a slow exponential growth and the rate of exponential growth. But just one level of exponential growth is very profound. Because if I take 30 steps linearly, I get to 30. If I take 30 steps exponentially, 2, 4, 8, 16, I get to a billion. And that's why the future changes so dramatically. I saw the DARPANET doubling every year in the 1980s, but it wasn't on anybody's radar map. It was just tying together a few thousand scientists. But doing the math, I projected a worldwide communication network tying together hundreds of millions of people to each other and to vast knowledge resources in the mid to late 1990s, and people thought that was ridiculous when the entire American defense budget could only tie together a few thousand scientists in a year. But it happened, and that's the power of exponential growth. And I don't want to get bogged down on the law of accelerating returns in this little chat. But I do want to make the point that it's not just computers. It's not just Moore's law. It was true of genetic sequencing. We doubled the amount of genetic data we've sequenced every year. The price has come down by half. Every year it's true of bits being moved around on the internet. And it's true of the brain. It's true of the amount of data we're getting on the brain is doubling every year. The spatial resolution of brain scanning is doubling every year. The scale and precision of the simulations are doubling every year. And I get into these debates, and people say, well, Ray, you are underestimating the complexity of the brain, and this is going to take centuries at the current rate. And I agree with that. It would take centuries at the current rate, but the current rate is not going to stay the same. The power of these technologies to perform this kind of work, including reverse engineering the brain, is doubling every year. If we were to make a linear assumption, and that actually is the assumption that's hardwired into our brains. Our intuition, hardwired, is linear. When we walked through the savannah 1,000 years ago, we made linear predictions about what would happen, where that animal would be in 10 seconds, and that worked just fine. So our intuition is linear. But the reality of this information technology progression is exponential. And they say you can't predict the future. It's amazing how predictable the future is. So I've kind of summarized a hour-long lecture in a few minutes, but I did want to provide that basic foundation. And as far as hardware is concerned, we'll have the computation to simulate the human brain very soon. In fact, the most conservative estimate is 10 to the 16th calculations per second. Hans Moravec estimates 10 to the 14th. There are varying estimates coming at it from different perspectives using different types of analyses. They all come out around the same. So using 10 to the 16th, we'll actually have that in a supercomputer by next year, 2011. IBM has one that's now being built that'll come online in 2012. We'll have it in $1,000 of computation by 2020, and by that time cloud computing will be very mature. It's already kind of where we're at in terms of computation. But we'll have plenty of hardware to simulate the human brain as we go forward in this decade and the next decade. Then the issue is, will we have the software? And that is particularly relevant to the topic of this conference because we're talking about enhancing the human brain. But one important point is I believe we will actually understand the human brain. We will reverse engineer it by 2019. I was actually on a panel recently in Israel at Shimon Peres's presidential conference, one of the panels I was on the future of the brain. And I was actually the conservative, the head of the Blue Brain Project, predicted that they will have reverse engineered the human brain by 2018. And that's based on his expectation that they will have a full human scale simulation of the neocortex by 2018. My view is that may happen, but it's going to take some time to actually get it to work, and there's other regions of the brain that are also important. The cerebellum, the hippocampus, where we consolidate new memories and feed them back down to the neocortex. There's other regions that are important that affect our emotional intelligence, and we need these also to simulate the human brain. We actually have to get the thing to work, to actually have it run. An important part of the project is actually to teach simulation. Useful facts: if you simulate the human brain and you have the equivalent of a baby, it's not necessarily going to impress us. And we've in fact invested a lot of our technology into educating biological brains. But my own view, and that's been consistent now for several decades, is that by 2029 we will have reverse engineered the human brain. And the point of that is not just to kind of set up a simulation where we don't really understand what's going on and just turn it on and it's going to simulate a human brain and produce human intelligence without an understanding. The whole point of it is to actually understand how it works, understand the principles by which the human brain creates intelligent behavior. Then engineering, technology can come in and take those principles and amplify them, focus them, make them more powerful, and we won't be subject to the incredible limitations that we have with the biological brain, that it has to fit in approximately 1 cubic foot. Big innovation with Homo sapiens is we have a large forehead, so we could afford a bigger cerebral cortex. It's about the width of a table napkin and about the size of a table napkin, but that was a lot bigger than the neocortex of other mammals. Only mammals have a neocortex. The neocortex, by the way, allows us to do hierarchical thinking, so that we can create a whole elaborate set of symbols, give that a name, and then use that name in another hierarchy of symbols and give that a name. And we call this nested hierarchy knowledge of ideas, and only human beings are really capable of doing that in a sufficiently powerful way to have language and technology, all of which are dependent on this hierarchical thinking. But once we understand these principles of how it works, we can create a neocortex that doesn't have to fit into 1 cubic foot. It can run out on the cloud. It can run on computers that are millions or billions of times more powerful. It doesn't have to be limited to the limited number of hierarchies that we're capable of thinking in. Consider what what technology and invention and engineering have done with other scientific principles, like Bernoulli's principle. It's a subtle principle that says if you have a moving surface, there's slightly less air pressure over a curved portion of that surface than a flat portion of that surface. Actually, it has to do with thermodynamics, and scientists are actually still arguing about the mathematical derivation of Bernoulli's principle. But engineering came in and focused its powers and leveraged it and created the whole world of aviation. So once we understand actually these basic principles of intelligence, we'll be able to do the same thing in our machines and actually amplify it and not be limited, for example, to a computing substrate that transmits information using electrochemical signals that travel a few hundred feet per second, that is 1,000,000 times slower than electronics today, or do computations in the internal connections at about 200 transactions per second, which is, again, 1,000,000 or 10,000,000 times slower than electronics. And the whole scope and scale can be vastly extended. But my view has always been that once we understand these principles of human intelligence, it's not going to be an alien invasion of intelligent machines to displace us. We're going to use it to extend ourselves. We are going to merge with that technology. And there's, of course, already many harbingers of that, and that's the topic, or one of the main topics of this conference, and I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot about that. There'll be other benefits from reverse engineering the human brain. We'll have better means of fixing the human brain. Dr. Richard Troche, one of the pioneers of the Parkinson's deep brain stimulation implant, says we are now treating the brain as circuitry rather than a chemical stew. And that is actually the kinds of interventions we've had so far, treating it as a chemical soup, adding a little more serotonin and reuptake inhibitors and things like that, which may have beneficial effects, but it's not really treating it as the complex network that it is. And now we are already beginning to do that. We'll also have greater insight into ourselves. Who are we? What does it mean to think hierarchically? What is thinking? Where does thinking take place? What are the limitations of thinking? And that has been the goal of the arts and sciences for millennia. And we will have much greater insight into this question from reverse engineering the human brain. And that is also going at an exponential pace. The spatial resolution of brain scanning is doubling every year, as I mentioned. The amount of data we're collecting every year is doubling. The supercomputers or even just routine computers that we have to simulate brain processes are doubling in power. And even just since my book, The Singularity is Near, came out in 2005, there's been extraordinary progress in the scale and scope of the simulations that are taking place. This diagram is from Singularity is Near. It's a block diagram of a dozen regions of the auditory cortex that have been modeled and simulated by Lloyd Watts and his team. And they've applied sophisticated psychoacoustic tests to that simulation to get similar results. Quite interestingly and relevant to one of the ideas behind this conference is we now have a simulation of the visual cortex. I actually had a long-standing argument with Tommaso Poggio, head of the MIT Vision Lab that did this work. He was telling me a number of years ago, well, we're really not benefiting a lot from understanding and reverse engineering the human brain in terms of our machine vision work. And I said, we had actually benefited quite a bit in our speech recognition work from the models of the auditory cortex processing that were coming out. And he said, but that's not happening in vision. And he was skeptical that that would happen. And when I saw him in 2006 at the Dartmouth conference called AI 50, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 1956 Dartmouth conference that gave artificial intelligence its name, he said, Ray, you were right. We now have these models of early visual processing in the visual cortex, the optic nerve, and we are applying these transformations and algorithms to our machine vision work, and we're getting a big leap in performance. It is helping out. And some of it is counterintuitive, which is the same thing we found with our speech recognition work. Interestingly, what they found, an interesting attribute of the eyes is that it's a tremendous data rate. There's millions of bits per second of data coming from the eyes, but they're reduced by the optic nerve and the early layers of the auditory cortex to 7 movies. And those movies pick up different kinds of features, but all 7 movies are very low resolution. There's very little data. And the rest of the brain, the neocortex, where we do our thinking and find patterns, and that's all the information it ever gets. So these 7 very low resolution movies. Now I remember some of the early work by Dr. Dobell in the 70s and 80s to create artificial retinas, and the work was controversial. First of all, because it required invasive surgery, and the results were not that encouraging at the time. He put out a press release that now blind people can read with these implants, but actually what he meant was it had 6 pixels of resolution. So he actually presented them with Braille cells, and then they could read 1 Braille cell at a time. It's not really reading from print. And so that was criticized. But, if you have an appreciation of the law of accelerating returns, you realize, if it's 6 pixels in 1980, it's going to become 600 and 6,000 and 6 million pixels, and ultimately will be quite useful. There's still an issue, though, even if you increase the resolution of these artificial retinas, which has been happening, it's difficult to actually feed that much information at high bandwidth into the brain. We find that's a difficult interface. All the interfaces that have been created so far are fairly low bandwidth. So one idea actually would be pick up very high resolution with an artificial retina, maybe ultimately comparable to the eyes or even greater, do the kind of transformations that the early visual system in the brain does, which we now have actually good models of, and we're improving those models all the time. And then you have low resolution data that is exactly the kind of data that is fed in by the early visual system to the rest of the neocortex, and then feed that in to the rest of the neocortex. And that is one idea that I've discussed with some of the pioneers in this field, and that is being pursued. There's many other areas that are being simulated. The cerebellum, where we do our skill formation, catching a fly ball. I always wondered, how does a kid do that? Because you've got to solve a dozen simultaneous differential equations in 2 seconds to catch a fly ball, and most kids haven't taken calculus, but we actually realized the cerebellum does do those calculations. It actually reduces them using a mathematical theory called basis functions, but we actually understand that and have modeled it and simulated and tested the simulations, and they're not perfect yet, and it's only a small portion of the cerebellum, but these, once you can do 1 million neurons, you can scale it up to 1 billion and so forth. The most interesting is the cerebral cortex, which is pictured here, and there are now simulations, different kinds of simulations, simulating the cerebral cortex at various levels of precision. And this is arguably the most important region. Interestingly, we've discovered some of the basic principles already. There is a little module in the neocortex, which is repeated perhaps 1 billion times, which is capable of recognizing a pattern and transmitting that pattern up and down the hierarchy of detectors in the neocortex. And interestingly, it's the exact same detector, pattern recognizer, that will detect, let's say, something very primitive like an edge or a crossbar on a capital A at the one hand, or detect irony or humor on the other hand. It's the same recognizer, and it's the power of the recognizer and the way they're wired together, and we're learning a lot about that. I had a debate with John Horgan, who took this picture and said, look at how complicated the neocortex is, and this is only a small slice of it. It's just these vast numbers of connections. We're never going to be able to simulate this. So actually, in preparation, this was in an article he wrote, and so in preparation for an onstage debate I was going to have with him, I looked up this picture, and it turns out it's not a picture of the neocortex at all. It's a picture of a computer simulation of the neocortex. So by definition, this level of complexity has been understood and programmed and modeled and simulated. But we're making exponential gains. As I mentioned, the Blue Brain Project expects to have a full-scale simulation at a high level of precision by 2018 of the neocortex. As I said, I'm more conservative than that on that issue. But we are scaling up our understanding of the brain. That'll certainly help us to augment the brain. My own view is, as we create more powerful forms of intelligence, and by the way, there's lots of artificial intelligence in the world today already. Our whole economic infrastructure will grind to a halt if all the AI programs stop tomorrow. That wasn't true 15 years ago. Those were research projects. Our main use of these technologies is going to be to augment the brain itself. And we are already augmenting, replacing every single system in the body. There's an artificial pancreas that's being developed. We have insulin pumps, thanks to our friend Dean Kamen. We have continuous measurement devices of glucose. We understand the algorithm that the pancreas uses, and there are artificial pancreases now being experimented with. We've had artificial kidneys called dialysis machines that have been big and bulky outside the body. They've now gotten small, but still outside the body. Now they're experimenting with putting them inside the body. There are artificial hearts, artificial lungs. I mean, every single system in the body we are experimenting with, augmenting, replacing, and so on. And of course, the most important region is the brain. You know, if I tell you, well, I have an artificial stomach, I don't, but if I told you that, you wouldn't think that it's no longer me. If someone came to you and says, well, I've replaced my brain with another brain, you might wonder who they are. So we do identify the concept of identity with the brain more than any other region. And clearly it's the region that distinguishes us from other species. That, combined with our opposable appendage, it allows us to take the thoughts from our neocortex and actually change the world. And we've started augmenting, replacing portions of the brain. The first example was the cochlear implant. The first ones were very crude, only a few different levels of frequency could be detected. Now they're up to about 1,000 levels or more, and you can actually use them to hear music and understand speech. They've come a long way. You know, once these devices get a foothold in our brains, they're going to be subject to the law of accelerating returns. There's a long history of retinal implants. It goes back to the late 70s with Dr. Dobell's work and other work. And these devices now have become increasingly sophisticated, and blind people with these experimental implants are able now to actually have meaningful interactions with the visual world. There's still issues with resolution, but they're increasing rapidly. I think the strategy I articulated earlier would be a good way to approach that. There are implants for Parkinson's disease, a little computer that actually replaces a fairly small corpus of cells in the brain. The computer is actually placed outside the brain with connectors inside the brain, but that has come a long way. Then a generation was introduced that was actually programmable from outside the patient. Then the latest version actually allows you to download pretty sophisticated software to the computer that's replacing this brain region that's inside the body. The New York Times actually ran an article recently expressing concern that people could hack into the software that people are downloading effectively into their brains. And that'll increasingly become an issue as we go forward. Ultimately, we'll create virtual reality inside the brain. But the virtual reality that's coming will be outside the body, glasses that beam three-dimensional images into your retina to provide augmented reality or virtual reality. We already have virtual reality with your cell phone. There's an iPhone app that allows you to take a video, point the video camera at a building, and you'll actually see inside the building based on the database and the GPS, and you can actually see that inside the building there's a Starbucks and so on. That ultimately will make its way into our eyeglasses. Now, you'll be hearing a lot more about all of these innovations and their status at this conference. I'll just spend a few minutes in conclusion reflecting on the challenge on how we might organize an XPrize for this kind of work. And I've been involved in a lot of the discussions being a board member of other XPrizes. And generally, it's pretty obvious what you want to do. I mean, when there was the first XPrize, which was to have a non-governmental commercial flight into space, it was clear you want to take a vehicle and go into space. And so then there was arguments about exactly what would the specs be, and you want it to be reusable, so we had a requirement that you had to actually go up twice within a certain period of time, and there were other parameters. And we argued about the rules, but the basic mission was clear. There's the Google XPrize Lunar Challenge to put a commercial craft unmanned on the moon And so again, it's clear what the mission is. You're going to put this device on the moon. And then there was discussion about, okay, once it gets there, what does it need to do? Uh, and so there was discussion about technical parameters. Uh, we have this XPrize on fuel-efficient cars, so we set a goal. It has to be 100 equivalent of 100 miles per gallon. If you have an electric car, we needed some equivalent, so we defined rules for that. And so that qualifies a car to be in the competition, and then you have a clear competition that which car provides the greatest performance in a race. The problem with this area is there's so many different areas that already have a multi-decade history. And I've mentioned a number of them in this talk, and you'll be hearing more of them as we go forward. If we focus on one of them, my concern is it becomes quite narrow. Then it becomes a retinal implant competition, not a brain machine interface competition. If we do it with Parkinson's disease, or the ability of a stroke patient or disabled patient to communicate with the world, it then becomes a competition for that specific application. And each of these applications are established research areas or little industries already, where there are people working and have a history that goes back quite far. And there's really not much connection between the people working in cochlear implants and retinal implants and Parkinson's implants and stroke patient implants. And I mean, they are interested in each other's literature, but they're really very distinct areas. One possibility, which would be a new thing for the XPrize, would be to allow any of these to compete, but then you'd need some kind of jury process, the way you have, say, with the Academy Awards. There's no clear distinction. What is it you need to do to win an Academy Award? You just have to get the most votes, and people think it's the best movie. So perhaps we could use that approach as to which is the best innovation among all these different innovations. So that really then would be a full-bodied brain-machine interface competition and wouldn't be focused on one area. If we focus on one area, it really becomes focused on that one application. It's no longer a broad human brain-machine interface competition. Another possibility, though, it would be to pick an exemplar application, perhaps the ability of somebody who really cannot communicate to be able to communicate. That does symbolize something that everybody can get behind. If you imagine the terror of locked-in syndrome or any of the equivalents where you're totally paralyzed and unable to communicate, we do have a lot of technologies which if somebody can just, wink or move a pinky, we can translate that into a meaningful interaction with a computer. But there are people who can't even do that with ALS or locked-in syndrome and so on. Perhaps a competition that would allow these people to communicate. And we may discover that people who appear to be in a vegetative state really are aware and able to communicate, and that could develop cognitively once they have that method of communication. So that's a possibility. Then there's this whole area of non-invasive brain-machine interface. There are new games coming out. I was involved with a project called computer-generated music, where we placed EEG sensors on a person's head in a certain place, and they created music, and it created a resonance with the alpha waves of that person. And then you could actually see on a screen their alpha waves increase as they actually heard their own alpha waves and created more alpha waves as a result. And you got a resonance between the music and the alpha waves of the person's own brain. There are now computer games coming out that have helmets that pick up EEG signals. EEG signals are very faint. There's some technical challenges. Not clear to me how well these low-price products actually pick up EEGs, given how faint they are. But this is an area where we could perhaps have non-invasive human brain-machine communication to provide say, communication for people who are paralyzed, or just communication by anybody's brain. There's this whole area of games being established, but there's certainly many practical and important applications of that area. So I don't have an answer. I think if we had to pick one, the ability to communicate with language is probably the most important. Alan Turing based his whole Turing test based on language. Language is an exemplar of human intelligence, of the hierarchical thinking that the neocortex is capable of doing. It was the first invention, spoken language and then written language. And there are people who cannot communicate because of profound disabilities, and to give those people the ability to communicate through man-machine interfaces would be inspiring. So I leave you with those thoughts, and I wish you a terrific conference, and I will eagerly await the results and knowledge that's shared. Thank you very much.